I don't have to tell you that China is the world's most important rising power, amongst others, the so-called BRICS. And by many measures, China is now the world's second leading power after the United States. And by various estimates of economists, the Chinese economy will overtake the American economy on aggregate sometime around 2025 or perhaps earlier. And every day that we open our newspapers or however we get our media and our information, not many people open newspapers anymore. I'm one of those creatures from the last century that still get my information in hard copy every day. But however we get our media, we see China in the news. That's not a new story. That's been going on for a couple of decades. But what is increasingly new is China's activities around the world being in the news. Gobbling up natural resources in various parts of the world, expanding China's own overseas investment. It's been a long-standing story that China is a recipient of inbound direct investment, has been for 3 decades. That's been one of the key sources of growth in China. But now a newer story is China's own export of capital, which I'll talk about this evening. China has been asserting itself more in its own Asian neighborhood in the last few years in various ways. Its military has certainly been modernizing, and its navy quite literally sailing into waters and oceans that it had not previously been to before. China is the sort of sought-after partner in global governance by the United States, to be sure, but European Union and other countries. China's certainly been broadening its global cultural presence. This interesting what you say about the NPR story on CCTV this evening. I have been tracking quite closely the emergence of CCTV and other Chinese media on the global scene, and indeed the last time I was here at USC, that was the subject of my talk. And I was, if I remember correctly, predicting that we should all pay attention to this because it's about to take off. Well, it has taken off in the last few years. I'll talk about that tonight too. So in many different ways, China's global impact is being felt quite literally on every continent, in most international institutions and on virtually all global issues. That's new in our media, but China's rise is not a new story. That's a relatively old story. It's been much discussed in the academic literature. It's been much discussed in the media now for a couple of decades. In fact, I recently looked on my own bookshelf in my office to see how many books I have with the title, with the words China and Rise in the title. And I've got over 25. I'm sure you're familiar with many of these. And some of them, I have to say, have some pretty fanciful titles, such as a very selling book of a couple years ago by Martin Jacques entitled When China Rules the World, The Rise of the Middle Kingdom and the End of the Western World. I'm not sure which part of that title is more provocative, the first part or the last part. But it's certainly a provocative title, and it's succeeded in selling Mr. Jacques over 100,000 copies, he told me, and it's been translated into 12 languages. So maybe that's what one needs to sell books, is a catchy title. He's got one, but there are many others. James King of the Financial Times published a book a couple years ago called China Shakes the World, The Rise of a Hungry Nation. Last year, and a scholar in Washington, an economist named Arvind Subramanian, published a book entitled Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Dominance. And I recently came across one called Death by China, written by some fellow down here in Irvine, actually. And just this week, a new book has apparently appeared I haven't seen called Devouring China, or China Devours the World, or something like that. So, some of these books have pretty catchy, provocative titles. But one way or the other, they all suggest the specter of a dramatic transformation of Asian and world affairs as a result of China's rise. Many of those books, I must say, that are written in this country, several of those I just mentioned were not written by American authors, but if you look at the ones that are written by American authors, they tend to view or juxtapose, I should say, China's rise against that primacy or the position of the United States in world affairs. So it's a pretty much kind of bipolar prism through which China's rise is viewed. What does it mean for America? Such is the case, for example, with Princeton University professor Aaron Friedberg's book, A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for the Mastery of Asia, which kind of summed it up right there, zero-sum game. I don't share that view myself, but I think it is characteristic of a number of American scholars that they tend to view China's rise exclusively through the prism of the US. And many of these other books, as I say, share the view that China's rise is going to be destabilizing in one or more ways. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to turn my own attention to this subject of China's rise. I'd written other books, but none not on the sort of phenomenon of China's rise. This is sort of new territory for me. But I wanted to do it somewhat differently than others had done it. I wasn't so much interested, in other words, of China's rise vertically and what it meant, for example, for the United States. I was more interested in you might call it China's spread horizontally and what it meant for the world. In my own thinking and teaching, I distinguish between foreign policy and foreign relations. Foreign policy, to me, is something that governments do. They articulate their policies, they try and implement their policies, whereas foreign relations is something that societies do. It's a much broader phenomenon, although the terms are frequently used interchangeably in both academic literature and journalism. I have to be careful here in the Annenberg School of Journalism what I say about journalists. But there is a distinction to be made, I think, between foreign policy and foreign relations. And if you're going to write a book about any country's impact on the world, you really have to look at both levels. It's a two-level game. Unfortunately, the vast majority of scholars look only at the first level. They only look at the governmental level. That's not sufficient, and it's certainly not sufficient to get a grasp of what the United States is doing in the world, for example, or what China is doing in the world. You've got to have a broader sense of the actors, non-governmental actors, and processes that capture really the totality of any country's interactions with the outside. And that's what I tried to do when I set off to work on this project 6 years ago. I wanted to try and get a sense or a grasp on as close to the totality of China's global presence and activities and influence and impact as I could, not just looking at Chinese foreign policy as viewed through Beijing. So when I started out, I assumed that China was having a big impact on world affairs, and that my job was sort of simply to explore and elaborate those dimensions of that impact. Kind of a hypothesis in search of confirming data, you might say, which is, I guess, is the way social science should be done. To some extent, you have to go off with hypotheses. And good social science, if your data doesn't confirm your hypotheses, you have to be honest and say so. Well, just to give you a kind of sneak preview of what I found in my research, even though I had expected to find that China was influencing the world in many ways, I found that surprisingly, China's influence in different dimensions that I'll talk about this evening is rather limited, in fact. And it is a far cry from that of the United States. And it depends, and that's why I have subtitled the book, The Partial Power. So the data did not fully confirm the hypothesis. Partially it did, but predominantly it did not. So I subtitled the book The Partial Power, because China is not a comprehensive power, I don't find. It's a partial power across the board in certain categories, and I don't want to overstate this, because in some categories China has more influence and impact than in other categories. But I find in general that China is present in the world, but not influential in the world. It's not influencing world affairs in different dimensions. So you might ask, what is power, first of all? That's, sort of international relations 101. And any international relations professor will tell you in IR 101, power is influence. Power is influence. Power is shaping the outcome of events or the trajectory of events. Power is shaping other actors. And in the classic definition by the American political scientist Robert Dahl, power is getting someone to do what they would otherwise not do. Okay, so if one takes that operative definition, which I do, and many scholars from Hans Morgenthau through to Joseph Nye have all used essentially the same definition, equating power with influence. So I want to put that out for you at the beginning of the lecture tonight, so you can keep that in mind. You may wonder, well, how can he be calling China a partial power? Because again, power equals influence. And as I walk through different dimensions this evening, and if you actually are so inspired as to buy and read a copy afterwards, which I encourage you to do, it makes a great holiday gift if you're looking for one. You'll see that China's influence and presence is uneven. It's mixed. And the country is actually beset by multiple weaknesses abroad, but not the least of those weaknesses that affect its position abroad are at home. So I just want to tag that. China's domestic scene, social, political, economic, intellectual, innovation, other technological, other dimensions, I find to be very fragile. But that's a subject for a different lecture and discussion. And I find that only in some sectors is China really exercising global influence as a global power. And you might ask too, what's your metric, Professor Shambaugh? My metric is the United States. Okay, that's a global power. My metric is not Brazil. My metric is not Belgium. My metric is not Australia. My metric is not Japan. It's the United States. And if you're going to be a global power, there is only one in the world today. That's the United States. So I'm comparing, in some ways, I am comparing China with the US. And I find, as I argue, China to be a long way behind the United States in terms of comprehensive power and international influence. Okay, so that's the basic thesis of the book. I should quickly say that there are some categories where China is really influencing world affairs. Global trade patterns, global energy markets, global commodity markets, global tourism industry, global real estate purchases, the global art market, and cyber hacking are the ones that I would identify. In these categories, quite seriously, China is a world leader. In the last category, cyber hacking, that's kind of a dubious distinction. So it is markedly influencing trends there, and there are a number of other sort of indices that one can identify that do suggest that China has the trappings of a global power. World's largest population, largest continental landmass, manned space program, aircraft carrier, world's largest museum, world's largest hydroelectric dam, second largest economy in the world, second largest military budget in the world, largest military in terms of manpower in the world, the world's highest annualized growth rate now over several decades, world's largest exporter, world's largest foreign exchange holdings, and the second largest recipient of foreign inbound investment, and the country that has the world's largest number of millionaires and billionaires today. So those are all indicators that yes, China is a pretty important power. Impressive indicators. But let's look at least the categories that I look at in this book and see where China comes out, beginning with diplomacy. This book, I should say, is organized functionally rather than geographically. I had originally thought that maybe I should write the chapters about China and Latin America or China and Africa or whatever, but decided in the end to not do that and to look at China's impact in different functional areas. So there are chapters on, first on China's global identity, then individual chapters on China's global diplomacy, China and global governance, China's global economic presence, China's global cultural presence, and China's global security presence. So 5 big categories. So let me talk briefly about each of these, beginning with diplomacy. And I find that China's diplomacy, generally speaking, remains remarkably risk-averse and guided by very narrow national interests. It is a kind of diplomacy that takes a lowest common denominator approach, adopting the safest and least controversial position on various issues, and particularly in the United Nations. And China usually waits to see the positions of other governments before revealing their own. But China is really a kind of backseat diplomat. It's not a front seat diplomat. It's not driving the car. It's not shaping international opinion on international diplomatic issues. It's not forging coalitions to deal with international issues. It's very passive, surprisingly so. The notable exception to its passivity is when it affects China's very narrow own self-interest: Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, human rights, and maritime territorial claims. On these issues, China's diplomats are hyperactive, and they are very assertive, shall we say. But other than protecting these sort of national interests, I find Chinese diplomacy, as I say, to be generally passive for a country of its size and its importance. And so one has to ask, why? Are Chinese diplomats simply adhering to Deng Xiaoping's dictum of Tao Guang Yang Hui, that we should bide our time and hide our brightness? Or is this all new? Is China arrival on the world scene as a major power come so quickly that they don't really know how to wield power? Possibly. Is it because they don't really know what they want? It's clear that it's very clear, I think, and if you study Chinese diplomacy and you read their statements, we know what China's against. That's very clear. Over and over and over, we know what they don't want. But what do they want? It's not so clear as to what kind of world they would like to see, other than the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So I find, in fact, that there's a kind of confusion in Chinese foreign policy, or schizophrenia. Sometimes we see China acting in a rather pragmatic, confident manner. Other times we see China reacting, I would argue, in a rather assertive, tough, abrasive, occasionally aggressive manner. We've seen more of that kind of China in the last few years than we have the former category. But we do see evidence of both. And the question is why? One reason I suggest in the book is that China's conflicted about its own international identity, or I should say identities, plural. And I have a chapter, as I say at the beginning of the book, that digs into the domestic Chinese discourse about their global roles. Because I've always felt in my career, in my previous writing, that the role of perception is really critical, really central, and very, very important in studying international relations. You have to understand the subjective factors more than the objective factors. So that's something I've done since my own doctoral work. And so I think it's important to get inside the mindset of any country and any group of elite and any public. So the whole second chapter of the book digs into the domestic discourse in China in recent years about their international role. And I discovered that it's a very animated discourse, a very contested discourse. There's no consensus, even though there is a kind of center of gravity in it. And there are many schools of thought that are competing in this discourse. And finally, the discourse is ongoing. It's not over. I lived in China during a sabbatical year in 2009-10 when I was primarily digging into this discourse, but the discourse goes on. And so I have a whole chapter that tries to unpack that discourse for the reader, and the argument is that China has a pretty significant identity crisis. They don't know what they want in world affairs other than to become wealthy. And they assume that wealth will translate into power. That has been an assumption of Chinese since the 1870s, not the 1970s, the 1870s, and the self-strengthening movement. But wealth, if you read Joseph Nye's recent work and others, wealth does not equal power. You have to convert wealth and other resources into power in order to exercise influence. Again, that being the definition of power. So I find that China's kind of contradictory global diplomacy is somewhat a reflection of the domestic identity crisis about who we are in the world. And one sees this also in the realm of global governance, which is sort of a subcategory of diplomacy, but I devote a separate chapter to. Global governance, of course, involves multilateralism, multilateral institutions, cooperation amongst nations to address transnational issues and challenges that affect all of mankind. By its very nature, global governance involves transcending national sovereign boundaries and contributing to so-called public goods, national contributions to global or regional public goods. And Western nations, I'm sure you're aware, have been arguing for China to become more involved in global governance in the last decade or more. In the famous words of Robert Zoellick, to become a so-called responsible international stakeholder. He gave a very important speech in 2006, I think, in New York, calling on China to become a responsible international stakeholder. And so scholars and diplomats, for that matter, also question whether China is a revisionist power or a status quo power in global governance. Is it trying to uphold the existing system or overturn it or adjust it? Is China shouldering its fair share, or is China free riding or selectively contributing to global governance? Does Beijing believe that there are common international public goods to which it should or has a responsibility to contribute? How does Beijing think about this whole notion of responsibility? 负责任的大国, it's called in Chinese, to be a responsible power. That's one of the issues that's contested in the domestic debates. So, as I say, foreign scholars have been studying China, increasingly studying China's global governance policy. And what they find, or what I find anyway, in chapter 4 of the book, is a very mixed picture. And this whole book is actually sort of a mixed picture on the one hand, on the other hand. I wish China was so simple that we could make statements about it that were not contradicted by other statements, but unfortunately China is a very contradictory country. And that's true in its external behavior as well. So in global governance, we do see China contributing to UN peacekeeping operations. We see China contributing to anti-piracy operations, counterterrorism, curbing greenhouse gas emissions, overseas development assistance or aid, non-proliferation, public health, and combating international crime. In all those categories, 6 or 7 categories, and there are case studies in the book on each of them, China is contributing and deserves credit for what it is doing in the global governance arena. Yet, if you look at other categories and broadly at this subject, I find and argue anyway that China punches way below its weight. It is not. It is free riding to a significant extent, and it is not carrying or contributing, I should say, proportionately to its size, wealth, or potential influence in various global governance categories. Take, for example, the United Nations operating budget. World's second largest economy, where does China rank in terms of its contribution to the UN operating budget? Number 7, okay? Other countries with much smaller GDPs contribute more. UN peacekeeping operations, I mentioned. This is one area that China is frequently given credit for, and China frequently gives itself credit for. Holds up as a major, Chinese diplomats are quick to tell you, we are number one amongst the UN Security Council in contributing UN PKO operations. Well, that's true amongst UN Security Council members. What if you look at all nations who contribute to UN peacekeeping operations, all members of the United Nations? Where does China rank? Answer number 16. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Denmark, Nigeria, many other much smaller countries contribute many more personnel to UN peacekeeping operations than does China, with a People's Liberation Army of 2.2 million under arms. ODA, overseas aid. China is, I'll talk about this a bit more in a second, but China is a contributor to overseas aid, about well, where do you think it ranks compared to other donor nations? Answer, not even in the top 20 in the world, not even in the top 20. Scandinavian states, Australia, Canada, the United States to be sure, most European states, Japan, others contribute more ODA than does the People's Republic of China. So, and there are other indicators, but the point is that it's sort of a glass of water half full, half empty. China's doing some things, but it's not doing as much, I don't think, as it can, or more importantly, should, given its size and role in the world. And why? So I find that China's global governance diplomacy is very, like its diplomacy generally speaking, very hesitant, very skeptical, rather risk averse. First of all, it doesn't really agree with the global governance is rooted in the post-World War II, that is, liberal order. And China has been very uncomfortable with that global liberal order for a very long time. Secondly, though, China's skepticism about global governance is rooted in their view that it's a kind of a trap laid by the United States to restrain China's rise, tie them down through involving them in issues in which they don't have a direct national interest. Well, that's the point to global governance. You don't have direct national interests in these issues. You contribute into the common good and hopefully address global problems as a result. The Chinese have, in my mind, a very transactional approach to diplomacy. It's like a kind of businessman's consciousness or a banker's consciousness. If I'm going to invest into this area of diplomacy, I want to know what I'm going to get out of it and when. What's the payoff? That's not the mentality one has to have when it comes to global governance. You're supposed to contribute, and you don't ask, what am I getting out of it, the People's Republic of China? You're hopefully addressing an international need. So that's another source of China's skepticism. But the view that the United States is trying to hold China down is also a prevalent one. These are some quotations from Chinese scholars that represent different dimensions of this skepticism. But I'll tell you an anecdote. I was interviewing a Chinese vice minister, a couple of years ago in the middle of the summer of 2010. And he said, David, you know, you Americans, you've been trying to restrain our rise for a long time, ever since the 1980s. And then you tried to do so by subverting us politically. That wound up in Tiananmen. You failed. We, the Chinese Communist Party, are still here, still in power, stronger than ever. Then he said in the 1990s, you Americans, you tried to contain us regionally. And that failed too. We broke through that, and we have the best relations we've ever had with our neighbors. I remind you, this is the summer of 2010, this middle of the so-called year of assertiveness, in which China had managed to go out and alienate and pick fights with virtually every one of its neighbors in a very short period of time. So I'm not sure who he had in mind, but the point is, he then said, now, you Americans, your latest tactic is to bleed us internationally through this concept of responsibility and global governance by getting us involved in your wars and your ventures abroad that we don't have a direct national interest in, and we're not going to fall for it. So for these various reasons, there's deep skepticism about global governance in China. And I think we should, even if we understand why, China is skeptical, we should still recognize that China punches below its weight, and the world, I think, should expect much more from Beijing in this area. I further argue in the book that China is a lonely power, I call it. It has no allies, and it has no close friends. No allies, no close friends. Its closest friends, even if you look at them, North Korea, which I'm not sure is such a close friend now, Russia, and Pakistan. These are traditionally the three countries with whom, and Cambodia, I suppose, with whom China has traditionally had closest relationships. At least in two of those cases, Russia and North Korea, there are a number of elements of distrust in that relationship on both sides. But China doesn't have any network of alliances, strategic. They have over 50 so-called strategic partnerships around the world, but how strategic are they? How close are they? I would argue not very at all, unlike the United States. You may question how the United States is doing. I think pretty well, and particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. So China is, in my mind, a kind of lonely power, and that's represented in global public opinion surveys of China. This is China. In the BBC poll of a couple years ago now, and you find China right in the middle, right next to the United States. You know, basically more people have positive views than negative views. So it's mixed. China has a mixed international image. It's not an overwhelmingly positive one, and it's not down there with Iran and North Korea. It's in the middle. But more concerning to the Chinese, and more interesting perhaps, is the trend line. And here is China in the middle. You may not be able to see it, the brown line. This is the Pew Global Attitudes Survey. And you'll see that China has an almost 20% drop in its global favorability ratings between 2005 and 2010. That's not very good. This is 2005 to 2010 was precisely the period of China's so-called charm offensive, when it was really beginning to push soft power and public diplomacy in Asia, at least. So, in fact, during that time, China's global image, at least measured in these BBC and Pew polls, was declining. So China's international image, I must say, is not terribly strong. I'll talk more about the cultural dimension of that in a second. So shifting from diplomacy to other categories, how does China rate in these other categories I look at? What about militarily? I argue that China is not able to project power outside of its Asian neighborhood. If you're going to be a global power, you obviously have to be able to project power outside on a global basis. And I argue with three important exceptions, and they're important exceptions: ballistic missiles, space, and cyber. China is not a global military actor or a security actor. Yes, ballistic missiles, they could put one into this room if they wanted to. Let's hope they don't want to. Cyber hacking, we've read a lot about. There they are, truly a global power. And they have a significant and growing space program. And they sell arms abroad, too, I should say. That's a kind of fourth category. Not many arms, $5.5 billion per year. Compared to the United States, $78 billion per year. So it's a fragment of that, and they're way behind even Russia. Russia sells $15.5 billion per year. So China's in third place in that category. Anyway, don't get me wrong, the People's Liberation Army has come a very long way in the last decade in particular. It has invested a lot of money. As I say, it has the world's second largest military budget now, $116 billion this year. And it's buying a lot of new weapons with that money. New armored personnel carriers, tanks, cruise missiles. These are photos I took, in fact, at the 2009 60th anniversary parade, which I was fortunate enough to witness. Short-range ballistic missiles, intercontinental range ballistic missiles. These are significant weapons. China's Navy now sailing literally, has upgraded a lot and is literally sailing into the Indian Ocean. But that's about it, frankly. It's sailing further into the Western Pacific, into the so-called second island chain. Occasionally they go through the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean. Occasionally they'll make port calls in West Africa. And very rarely they come into this hemisphere. So their navy is not a blue water navy. It's not a global navy. Their Air Force, not a global Air Force. They have in-flight refueling, but not very many tankers. So their military capacity, don't get me wrong, I would not advise invading or attacking China. And you wouldn't get very far. And China has also now gained the capacity to wage, in my view, a successful conflict over Taiwan. But China's military power is regional. It's not global. But that doesn't mean it isn't changing the balance of power in Asia. It is, and it will continue to. And certainly if you couple the capacity to project power further and further from its own shore with its maritime claims, you see the dangers for its neighbors. So broadly speaking, though, I don't find the Chinese military to be a global power. It's a regional power. What about culture? Well, last time I was here at SC, gave a lecture on China's soft power and cultural impact, and I was focusing more then on the dimensions of it and the what I call the messengers. There are a number of, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention China also now has its own aircraft carrier, the refurbished Ukrainian carrier that they call the Liaoning. So there are a number of dimensions in which China is now active internationally in culture. So it is beginning to gain some traction abroad, but I would argue that it is not setting global trends and remains still little known outside of China. But that doesn't mean the Chinese are not really obsessed, I would argue, with this concept of soft power. They are obsessed with it and have been for now 4 or 5 years. You know, what is it, soft power? Do we have it? If we don't have it, why don't we have it? Where can we get it? Can we go buy it? Is there a kind of Walmart of international relations? You can go down the soft power aisle or the culture aisle and buy a soft power kit off the shelf. They wish it was so easy, because they would try and buy it. And I would argue that's exactly what they are trying to do, is buy soft power. Soft power doesn't work that way. You earn soft power. You don't buy soft power. And China is investing very heavily into its international media, into all of these categories, in fact. But to date, I would argue that it has not produced much payoff. But soft power has been on the national agenda since 2008, when then President Hu Jintao put it there and first used the term rencheli in his 17th Party Congress report. The money, as I say, is being poured into these institutions, what I call the messengers, and others. The nerve center of this whole operation is the State Council Information Office, the Guoxin Ban. They are the Orwellian nerve center of this massive global operation to try and increase China's voice, increase China's influence, and increase China's cultural presence abroad. It's a very coordinated program. There is an annual plan, just like for many other things in China. The annual plan is first internal, it's Neibu, and then the next year it's made public. You can actually read it in the journalism yearbook of the Institute of Journalism at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, if you want to read what the Guoxin Ban's annual blueprint is. So anyway, the money is poured into all these various operations: Xinhua News Agency, CCTV, China Radio International, the Confucius Institutes, which the Han Ban runs, and newspapers in China Daily and others. China Daily has become much better, by the way. But I would argue no matter how much you resource the messengers, it depends on your messaging. And I would argue that China has real problems with its messaging. Several, maybe 3 or 4 specific problems. One is language. They're prone to what they call ko-hao, sloganeering. And these ko-hao may be understood inside of China. In fact, all of us who go to China and we talk to Chinese about the latest ko-hao, you ask your Chinese friends what is meant by the latest ko-hao, and 50% of the time at least nobody can understand the latest ko-hao and explain it to you. But outside of China, these ko-haos don't translate. They just don't work. Nobody understands them. Nobody cares about them, largely because they're domestic slogans that are then used externally. And here are some examples of them. And foreigners just don't understand them, and they don't biaotai to them. In China, when you encounter a government ko-hao, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to biaotai. That is literally to repeat it so as to show your adherence to it, your internalization of the message, and your feed it back to show that you are a loyal citizen. Well, foreigners aren't about to do that. They don't understand it in the first place, and even if they do understand it, they're not about to parrot it back. So language is part of the problem. Secondly, the so-called China model I find to be admirable, its economic growth model that is, but not replicable nor exportable. There are a series of sui generis reasons that China has been able to modernize itself economically that cannot be replicated in other countries. So there are various impediments, I would argue, including China's political system at the end of the day. Shambaugh. Well, as long as you have individuals like Shambaugh in solitary confinement doing an 11-year prison sentence in Liaoning province for so-called subversion of state power, you're not going to earn much soft power abroad, at least political soft power. So I would argue that the real Achilles heel of China's soft power is its political system. There are other impediments, but at the end of the day, nobody wants to replicate China's political system. In fact, I once went to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago, and I asked them, can you give me some statistics on how many political asylum applications you have had? And the man looked at me like I was from Mars. Political asylum applications? Well, I don't think we've ever had one. Exactly. Joe, sure. You know, who wants to seek political asylum in China? Nobody. So there are various impediments to China's soft power. On the measures of Joseph Nye's criteria, their soft power I find to be extremely soft. So if you wonder where I am now compared to the last time I stood here at USC, even lower. I was skeptical then. Now we have some data for it. Okay. What about economics? Briefly. This is the one category where you would expect China to have significant global influence, right? And they do in the areas I previously mentioned: commodity markets, energy, trade. But if you scratch beneath the surface, even in the area of trade, but in other areas as well, it's not China's power is not as great as it's often assumed. Trade. 94% of China's exports are merchandise exports, low-end merchandise exports. They're not what you might call knowledge-intensive products. China is not at the cutting edge of global innovation in most categories, maybe a few, but not most. They're not sourcing new ideas, despite the money that is being poured into R&D. What about overseas investment I've mentioned? So it's going up, right, since 2006. There's a rather steady trajectory. Last year's figure came in recently. China exported $77.2 billion abroad last year in ODI, which places it 5th internationally, number 5, and 1/5 of the amount the United States exports abroad. So long way behind the Americans, but long way behind the United Kingdom, long way behind Denmark, long way behind the Netherlands. China's not in the upper leagues yet of global ODI. And then if you actually look at where the ODI is going, you find that 4 of the top 5 destinations are tax havens: Luxembourg, Grand Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and Hong Kong. So this is not really investment. This is money, much of it so-called hot money, looking for a safe haven. And then that which is not going to safe havens is going increasingly into mergers and acquisitions, not what's known as greenfield investment. Which brings me to the question of Chinese corporations and branding, which is a really interesting topic, something I really enjoyed looking at in this book and research, and will continue to look at. So just ask yourselves, how many Chinese brands can you name off the top of your heads? Lenovo, yep. Haier, Huawei, Qingdao beer, that's my favorite. This is a man after my own, this is my favorite brand too. Air China, maybe Li Ning Sportswear. Any others? I mean, I can't even get to 10, and this is my area of specialty. Most of us can't get to 10. That's because China doesn't have globally known brands. There is an index, a kind of Bible, you might call it, of international branding, published every year by Business Week magazine and Interbrand. And it lists the top 100 brands globally. Guess how many Chinese brands show up in that index last year? None. Mayo-Iga. Not one. So that's an index. That may change over time, but for the time being, here we are in 2013, no Chinese brands in the top 100 internationally. What about another index of China's multinational corporations? Global Fortune 500. That's considered to be kind of the Bible of multinational corporations. Well, the Chinese do pretty well. They've got now 71, as of last year, 71 companies in the Global Fortune 500. In fact, this is a 2011 chart, and China was slightly behind Japan. 2012, China has now overtaken Japan, ranks number 2 in the world in terms of these companies on the Fortune 500 list. The thing is, the Global Fortune 500 list is compiled by total revenue, aggregate revenue of a company. It doesn't matter where the revenue is earned. So if you look at the 71 companies, you find that only 3 of them, I think, earn more than 50% of their revenue outside of China. They're all domestic operators, Sinopec included. Sinopec, the largest oil company in China, makes all of its money inside of China, or most of it. So China's multinational corporations are not really multinational in terms of revenue stream. They're certainly not multinational in terms of personnel and management staff in particular, or governance standards, or transparency standards, or any other standard that we use to evaluate multinational corporations. And they have encountered, I mean, they are trying to go global, but in fact, I have a long discussion of this in the book. Many of them have stumbled badly. Many have encountered real problems abroad. Legal problems, political problems, really cultural problems. They're going to overcome those problems, but so far they have not done very well. So Chinese multinational corporations I find also to be partial power in this domain. And in other rankings you find this too. But for the sake of time, I'll skip some of those other indexes by, Transparency International, World Economic Forum, and other organizations, the World Bank. They measure countries in different categories. China's ranking is actually considerably low in a number of these rankings. So where does that leave us in conclusion? I find that China is a global actor, but not yet at least a global power, not a comprehensive power. It's a kind of uneven power, or a partial power. And it's has an identity crisis, very highly conflicted about being a global power, particularly in the realm of global governance. There are, as I say, some exceptions to this where they are a global power. Tourism, now the world's largest exporter of tourists. And those tourists are spending money, big money, $59 billion last year abroad, according to China's own National Tourism Administration. Much of that money is being spent on luxury goods. China has rescued the international luxury good market since 2008 in its time of crisis. Global energy commodity markets, I've mentioned, very important. Art. 40% of all art sold at auction worldwide last year purchased by Chinese. Not just Chinese art, all art. Western art, too. So they're a global leader in the art auction industry, and they're certainly a global leader in cyber hacking and in some international sports and the global property market. So there are categories in which China is a global leader, but not in the 5 big categories I look at. Now, over time, I mean, you have to realize this book is something of a kind of static snapshot of a dynamic process. It's changing, and it's going to change over time. And 5 years from now or 10 years from now, Chinese brands will be better known. Chinese fashion designers are already becoming better known, but will become even more so. China has now its first Nobel Prize for Literature, at least by a resident writer. They had Gao Xingjian won it, but after he had emigrated to France. Chinese film now beginning to get a little bit of traction abroad. And 10 years from now, maybe the Chinese Navy will have its so-called string of pearls access arrangements, naval facility access arrangements through the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. Who knows? Diplomatically, maybe China will be more proactive, less risk averse. Maybe China will be more assertive. There are certainly many voices in China who are calling for that. And I think since Xi Jinping has come to power, we have seen in his speeches about the China Dream and other indicators of a more robust, more assertive, tougher, nationalistic China that we're going to get in the years ahead. So these things are changing. They can change. So 5 years from now, the trend line may go this way, but it may stay like this. It may stagnate. It could even go that way for domestic reasons. But for the time being, I find that China, if looked at across these categories today, is a partial power.